There are some basic tools and supplies that you're going to need to get started: a sewing machine, fabric, scissors, needles, etc. On the front door of this lesson, there should be a PDF download of the full list of supplies and tools that you're going to need. There's also a transcript of this lesson. So this lesson includes things that you need to look for when thinking about purchasing a sewing machine, scissors, needles, and everything that you would need. So listen closely and take notes. I give a lot of tips about the tools that I like, what to look for, and the things you shouldn't buy. So let's get started with the talk about the sewing machine. Of course, you're going to need a sewing machine. I have a couple styles here. This one here is an industrial sewing machine. If you're a fashion student, this may look familiar. If you're just going into a fashion school, this is probably what they'll have in their sewing studio. This particular brand, Juki, is my favorite brand. I'm not trying to sell you this brand, but this is the brand that I pretty much like. So this particular model only does a straight stitch. It only does one kind of stitch. So understand that if you're a beginner, you're probably more likely to purchase a home sewing machine, which gives you a variety of stitches. So let's actually talk about the home sewing machine first. This model ran me, I think, about $125. The actual model is CS5055PRW, and it's the Brother brand. So you might need to check on their site to see if this model is still available. So this one ran about $125 to $150, depending on what site you're purchasing on. If this particular model is not still available, there is something that is comparable to it. When I get a lot of questions when beginners are asking me what type of sewing machine they should purchase, I let them know that their ceiling for their price that they set should be no more than $300. I mean, $300 for me is pushing it a little bit for a beginner. You don't really know yet that you're actually going to enjoy sewing. So I usually try to cap it about $200. So they're actually really good machines between the $100 and $200 price point. So it just depends on the brand and all of the extra things that come on them. So this particular model has a lot of different stitches. I always tell beginners, look for a all-in-one step buttonhole. So that's very important, so you don't have to keep twisting the dial to get the top, the bottom, and the sides done. Just make sure it has an all-in-one buttonhole attachment. So again, you don't have to buy this brand. It's just a brand that I particularly like. There are other brands, Janome, Singer, Bernina. All of these brands are really terrific, and they have models within the $100 to $300 price range. Just understand that when you are looking for a machine, the first thing that you need to set is your price, the top price that you're setting it at, and start from there and work your way down as far as the different types of machines and all of their accessories and things that they're capable of doing. So this model here, this industrial machine, it only does one stitch, and it's very, very basic. So this runs brand new, depending on where you purchase it from, can run between $850 and $1,000 or even $1,200, depending on the table and the motor. This particular model has a servo motor. It actually doesn't make any noise while it's on, and I can actually control the speed of the sewing along with it. So that is an added feature which I paid a little bit more for. So if you live in an area where apparel production is a thing, then you can actually go to apparel supply companies, and they may have used machines for a much less price. I mean, I've seen them being sold for $250, $300, $350, including the table, which is actually a pretty good price. But understand that, you know, most students can't afford this. So I would actually start off with a home sewing machine just to get you started. Once you decide this is it, this is the thing I'm going to be doing, then actually purchasing an industrial machine would probably be great for you, especially if you're going to be doing a lot of custom work. So let's talk about sergers and overlocks. Sergers and overlocks are the same thing. So in the fashion industry, they call it an overlock machine, and this is an industrial overlock machine. This is a home serger. They do the same thing, it's just different words. Now, I also believe that in Europe, they call these home machines, they also call them overlock machines. And what they do is they just finish the edge of the fabric for you instead of having to apply a seam finish. So in some of the exercises and the projects, we will have a lot of seam finishing exercises, especially those of you who are taking the fashion production side. And we will use the overlock extensively for those. Now, for the home sewers, if you don't want to purchase one of these, you don't have one of these, it's not in the beginning, it's not really required. I will show both methods for finishing your seams with a regular sewing machine and also with an overlock machine. Now, if you're going to be sewing knits and doing a lot of knitwear, an overlock machine is essential. I've heard a lot of arguments that you can sew knits with a regular sewing machine with a stretch stitch or a zigzag stitch. Be that it may, that you can. If you consider yourself a professional or going into professional knitwear design or custom knitwear apparel, you need to be making it with a overlock serger. You need a double needle and you need a 4-thread. So you really need that to actually sew those, to actually make it look professional. There is another machine that you could consider purchasing, but I will do a separate tutorial on a machine that's called a cover stitch machine. So that's very kind of an advanced machine. But if you're going to be doing custom apparel in knitwear, a cover stitch machine will be pretty essential. So just understand in the beginning that an overlock serger machine is not essential, it's just nice to have. You'll need an ironing board and an iron. They don't need to be expensive, so check any secondhand stores. They may have some of these available. So ironing boards come in various sizes and shapes. So I have a full-size stand-up one, which comes up to about my waist, which is nice. For smaller spaces, there are tabletop ironing boards that work quite well. Both of these models have a space here to pull out to place your iron on for when you're working, so that comes in handy. So another thing that you should know about ironing boards is that the top of the fabric will get worn as you use them. These can actually be replaced. Once you become a very good sewer, you can actually make your own cover for this. Until then, many stores have ironing board covers available to you. So you should know that with the various sizes of the ironing boards, there are much wider boards that you can get in both the tabletop and the stand-up, but that's of course a personal preference. If an ironing board is not your style, you can also purchase one of these, which is a pressing mat. These also come in various sizes, and this is actually about a 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch thick, and it's actually pressed wool together. The thing that you need to be careful about these pressing mats is that because that they are wool, if you're using steam on it, the steam is going to go all the way through the bottom and it will hit your table. So if you're pressing with the mat on a table, you'll need to protect underneath. You won't really need to worry about that with an ironing board because it's actually all self-contained. So let's talk about irons. So this is one of my personal favorites. I call it my Old Faithful. This is a Rowenta I've had for many, many, many years. Back when I was actually in college, I bought this. It's been on many photo shoots and pressed many, many things, and I just really love it. But it is kind of heavy, so understand that the more commercial size irons are fairly heavy. So if you need something that's a little bit lighter, you may go with something that is very inexpensive like this. And these can be, this one is probably runs about $10. It's a very basic iron, and it just has a dial here to set the heat control, and then there's a spot here for your steam, and then you can put in water here to use the steam portion of the iron. Now let's talk about steam for just a second. It's not necessary to use steam in the beginning for your fabrics when we do any of the samples. We're going to be using 100% cotton in the beginning exercises, and a lot of times steam will actually shrink the fabric, so be very careful about that. And of course, within those projects, I will be explaining exactly how to use the iron and when you're going to be ironing and when you're going to be pressing. Another iron I have here is actually a cordless iron, and it sits in a base, and I have the plug comes out of the base, and it actually warms up while it's sitting in the base, and you can actually take it off and there's no cord. So if you have the base sitting on a table and you need to iron over across the room, this comes in handy. Now understand that this particular iron and the other cordless that I've had don't really keep their heat for a very long period, so it probably stays hot enough to press and iron for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then you'll need to replace it back into the base, make sure it clicks in so that it actually starts warming up again. So this ran, I think, $40 to $60. I'm not exactly pretty sure exactly what I paid for it, but there are a lot of different styles of cordless if that's what you're looking for. Another thing that you will need along with the ironing boards and the iron is a press cloth. And this is not anything extravagant at this point. It's basically an extra piece of fabric. This is an extra piece of muslin, which is 100% cotton, which is really great. So you're going to want to have an extra piece of your fabric available to lay over your work while pressing. We don't want to damage the fabric from the product that we're working on. So that's why a press cloth will go over that nicely. So the next time you're at the fabric store and you're purchasing some fabrics for your projects, just purchase a little bit extra, and you can use that piece of fabric as long as it's a natural fiber, cotton, linen, or wool. They are really great press cloths. Again, these don't need to be expensive items, but you will need something to get you started. You will need two types of scissors. You'll need fabric scissors and you'll need paper scissors. So these here are fabric scissors. These are a 9-inch shear, which is very popular with tailors. The blade is very wide, and this is actually good for very thick or heavy fabric. Tailors are most commonly cutting through wools, so this saves their hands because of the depth of the blade. These are an 8-inch scissor shear, which these are my favorite. These are for actually medium to lightweight fabrics, and what I like about this pair is that it has a serrated edge which actually grips right onto the fabric as you're cutting. It's really great for cutting knits. Now both of these I have a preference for brand. These are Ginger, Gingher, and that's also listed on the site. You don't have to purchase these. Another brand also is Fisker, and also Kai, Kai brand are very good scissors as well. When you purchase a fabric scissor, you just want to make sure that the blade is really nice and long. And even though this is for a lighter weight fabric, the blade is nice and long here. This means that I can actually continue to sharpen it. So these two are very nice. Also, you want to make sure that you're only going to be using these for fabric. These are kind of expensive. So you don't have to buy a super expensive pair, but you need a pair that is going to fit comfortably in your hand and that is a weight appropriate for you. So if you can try these out at the store, then do so you can give a few cuts. You know, you want to be able to cut into the fabric and see how it cuts, if it cuts a nice clean line and that it's comfortable in your hand, because your motion is that you're going to be going up and down all the time. So just keep that in mind. Another pair of scissors that you're going to need is paper scissors. Now, these don't have to be expensive. You can pick up a pair like this, which was at the dollar store for $1 or $2. You know, they don't have to be expensive. You're just going to be cutting paper with these. And if you're a home sewer, these will be fine. Now, if you're a fashion student or working in the industry, these will look familiar. These are what we would consider industry standard paper scissors. The reason why they're so long is because you may need to reach way across the table to cut the fabric. This short edge here actually enables you to cut very tight curves. So that's why these are quite popular in the industry. Remember, in the industry, they used to be cutting a lot of paper markers, and so these came in really handy, although these are quite heavy. The difference between this pair and this pair is that this one is much lighter. So it's not just the style. If you're a home sewer, don't worry about these. Even if you're a fashion student, you may not be required to purchase these. Just know that a lot of fashion programs, when you buy their kit, this is the style that you will get in that kit. So again, really, what you're really going to need is a very good pair of fabric scissors and a decent pair of, paper scissors for cutting the patterns out and other things. Just understand that you don't want to get the two mixed up. Only cut fabric with your fabric scissors and only cut paper with your paper scissors. So with that said, again, see if you can try out the scissors in the store and find something that you're going to be comfortable with. You'll probably want to purchase a pair of Snips. These are smaller, tiny scissors that can clip small pieces of fabric and threads, especially while you're at the machine. We don't want to be lugging around our big scissors. In my experience of watching students run around the sewing lab, sometimes they will drop their scissors and then they either have to replace them or get them sharpened. So having these in your hand to actually just clip threads at the machine is really handy. A lot of times what I will do is I'll leave my scissors on my cutting table and then I'll have these at the machine or even actually tied with a string to the machine, so I always have a pair at the machine. So there are these two types. I really like these. They're very light and they're very expensive, and when they get old and dull, then I can just get another pair. And I would like to say that you can buy a whole 10 pack of these online or at possibly at an apparel supply company for $10 or $12. So they're relatively inexpensive. I have this other snip here, which is much nicer. This is also a Ginger brand, as my favorite. For the more diligent sewer, they like to have the same snips all the time, and they like the actual motion of the scissor. You can also cut small areas of the fabric. If you're at a machine and you need to clip a corner at that point, these are probably a little bit better than something like this because this has a little bit more weight and the blade is a little bit nicer. These are also a little bit more expensive. So just be aware of that. So having snips in your kit and nearby is going to be very handy for you. A seam ripper. A seam ripper is going to be very important. In fact, this is probably going to become your best friend and your arch enemy at the same time. So a seam ripper is to rip out your mistakes, rip out seams, and they come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. I like these ones with the bigger handle. I've also seen them in brown and also in a much larger handle to hold on to. But in your sewing career, whether you're going to be a home sewer or you're here as a fashion student, this is going to become very important, and you should probably have a few of these in your kit. Sometimes you can get very excited or the ripping gets very rigorous and you break your seam ripper. You'll want to have another one on hand. So they also come in this little size. If you purchased a new machine recently, you may have received one of these in the kit. Now these are fine, there's nothing wrong with these ones, but I just feel that they're too small and a lot of times they don't hold up. Some people really like these ones and I personally don't care for them. So when I get them, when I buy a new machine, I usually just kind of just put them away just in case I break all of my other seam rippers. But I really prefer this heavier one. So try out a few, look to see what they have at your store and what you might feel with. It's the same kind of feel that you would have with your scissors or your snips. You want something that's going to be comfortable. Trust me, you're going to be spending a lot of time with this little guy. You will need some hand sewing needles, and I like this package because there are a lot of different styles of needles to choose from. Let me just open this up here so you can have a look-see. The many different types of needles, and in the window it'll tell you what style of needle: tapestry, chenille, embroidery, milliners, which is for hat making, and then sharps, embroidery, and darning needles, and that's to repair holes. So we're going to be using sharps, and if you don't want to purchase a large package like this, you can just purchase a package of sharps, and what they are specific sized needles. Now we're going to be using size, if you can see when you purchase, they'll have a size at the bottom, and we're going to be using size 7 or 9. So if you find them at the fabric store, that's the size you would want to purchase. Now when you're looking for needles at the store, stick pins or straight pins are going to be nearby. You won't find a box like this at your Michael's or Joann's or regular fabric stores. These you will have to get at a industrial sewing supply store. They are the Prim brand, size 21 extra fine, and this is actually a whole pound, and this box probably runs about $15 or $20, but it will last you a lifetime. The previous box I owned of these, it lasted me about 10 years, and I think I still have some of those left. So let's have a look at these really quick. So when I open these up, now these don't have the ball heads on them, but we'll talk about those in just a second. The reason I like these are a flat head, and they're rather long, and they're really thin. And so I actually recommend these to my fashion students because they are really great for all kinds of sewing, a lot of different types of fabrics because they're so thin, but also they work out really great for when you're draping fabric in all of your draping classes, to actually pin all those pleats and gathers and things like that as you're draping your fabric. Now for the home sewing students, you may not like these ones, and that's just fine. So a lot of other students like, even in my fashion classes, they like these pins. They're very long. They're extra long. These are actually called Quilters Pins, and they have this little ball on the end of it, which is easy to pick up. Now, there are other colors that you can get in these, but they're all pretty much Quilters pins, or sometimes they'll be a little bit longer, and they'll be called silk pins. Those are fine as well. But understand that these balls here on these specific pins, they're plastic. So when you're pressing, you have to be really careful that you don't run your iron over this ball head, otherwise it will melt. And I've seen people actually melt that right into their fabric because they think they need to keep the iron on for a long time. So just be aware of that. If you can afford it, there are ball pins, there are Quilters pins that are like this, and I'll put a few of these in my hand so you can see what they look like better. They actually do sell glass head pins, so if you can afford those, they're rather expensive, but they won't melt if you iron over them. So for the sake of all of the exercises for the home students, I will be using these pins, but I'll be very careful not to iron over them. And the reason I'm going to go ahead and use these yellow pins is because, one, they're quite popular, and two, I want you to be able to see where I'm pinning, and the yellow will kind of give it away. All right? So now, along with the pins, you're going to need something to hold on to your pins once you actually start taking them out. And I use a magnetic pin holder. I usually keep this next to the sewing machine, so when I'm pulling out the pins, I can just drop the pins right onto the magnetic holder like this. You may also use a tomato. I don't actually personally have one of those right now, so they usually end up getting lost or thread gets turned around them. But if you are more organized, along with the pins, you're probably going to want a pin holder, and this is a magnetic pin holder. I usually keep this by the sewing machine, so as I'm pulling out the pins, I can just literally drop it on top. I don't actually have to worry about trying to pin something back in. Some of you may prefer the tomato, which comes with a lot of different sewing kits. I prefer the magnetic holder just for ease. Understand, if you're going to use the magnetic holder, that eventually your pins will become magnetized and they will stick to your snips and your scissors. So just be careful when you're cutting with your scissors or snips that the pin is actually not in between the blade. So a couple other things you may want are threaders and thimbles. And let's start with the threaders. And I have a needle. I don't know if you can see that there. I'm going to put a piece of black fabric down here so you can see where my needle is. You can see that, and the eyes are very small on a lot of these things. So what the threader does is that you have a metal piece up here, and it's got an opening here in that little metal piece. And what you can do is you just slide the pointed part through the eye of the needle, right until the needle head is all the way up to the end of that metal part. I'm going to set this down, and then I'm going to grab some thread. I'll cut off some thread here. When you've got that holding the needle and the thread, insert the thread through that opening on the threader, and then all you have to do is gently pull that through the eye of the needle, and your needle is now threaded. Now the thimble protects your finger, the tip of your finger, for when you're sewing, especially if you're trying to push this through heavier fabric. It just protects your finger from getting stuck on either end. So you may just want to have these two things on hand. They're not a requirement, but they will certainly help you save your eyes and your fingers. So you're going to need some marking tools, and the marking tools will help you to mark your fabric for placement. So these pieces here are actually pressed chalk, and they come in a lot of different colors and a lot of different sizes. And what is nice about this is most tailors use this to mark areas on the fabric because it actually scratches right off on, of course, lighter fabrics. But it also washes out completely. So you can find similar looking pressed chalk at any local fabric store. If you're in the fashion industry, you can find ones that look exactly like this at your local industrial apparel store. There's another type of chalk as well that you'll also be able to find at your local fabric store, and this is actually refillable. It's actually a dust chalk, and you refill it. Some of it came out there. You can see that it's actually a chalk, but what's nice about this is that you can continue to refill it. It comes in multiple shades, just like this other chalk here. But it has a very fine tip here with a scrolling pen, and the chalk only comes out in one direction. So let me turn this over, and it makes a very fine line. It will not, well, this one does. Usually they only mark in one direction, but this actually makes it very nice because you can mark a very fine line. And of course you can refill this with other types of chalk. So there's another type of chalk that I'm not particularly fond of, and it's actually a wax chalk, and it looks like this. It's actually wax, similar to like a candle wax, and this also comes in multiple colors. And what is nice about this is that it completely disappears when you iron your fabric. So this is actually popular when you're working with, like, say, a linen or a wool, a thick fabric, where it's actually not going to stain. But understand, this is wax. So I can make marks here, and when using the iron, it disappears completely. But I'm not sure if you can see that on the camera. Where I marked, there's kind of a little demarcation here. That will probably go away once the fabric has completely cooled down. But I want to warn you that if you use different colors of this wax on your fabric, on lighter color fabrics, that when you use the iron to remove the wax, that color, that dye that is in this wax will probably remain on your fabric. I've seen it happen, and it's a very unfortunate thing. So just be very careful about the waxy marking instruments. I also want to mention something about both of these types of chalks or wax chalk marking tools, is that they can be sharpened. So whenever you need a sharp edge, you can just use, some people use a razor blade and just resharpen the edges, and the same thing with this chalk. Now I'd like to move on to my favorite marking instruments, and it's these pens here. You can also get larger markers. They're called friction pens by Pilot, and the nice thing about these is they come in so many variety of colors, as you can see here, and styles of pens. Like I said, they also come in a thicker marker. What's nice about these is that it's a very fine point, and when you iron, they disappear, just like the wax, but these don't leave a mark. So let me just show you here. So make a mark. Here I've got some red, I've got some black, and using the iron, when it's pressed, it automatically goes away. So I really like these. They're really convenient, and they fit very nicely into your kit. You don't have to worry about them breaking or whatever. The one thing about these that you do have to understand is that if they get too warm, like you leave them in your car, when the next time you try to mark, it won't mark because it is actually warm. It disappears with the heat. So if that happens, I've always suggested to my students, put them in the freezer for a few minutes, get them cold, and perhaps it will come back. It has worked that way, but understand that they don't go away. The other thing is, if you don't have an iron, these pens here on the tip have a special eraser, and the reason they're called friction is because when you erase on the fabric with the tip, it creates the heat that you need to erase. But I'm going to warn you a little bit, just be careful with that any kind of friction that you put on your fabric is also going to cause deterioration or stretching in that area of the fabric. So there you have it. Those are my favorite, although maybe not the wax chalk favorite marking instruments, but I use all of these. It just depends on the fabric. If you have a fabric that can sustain a lot of pressing, I would use the friction pens, whereas if you have a higher quality fabric, such as maybe silk, I might use this chalk here because you can actually dust it right out of the fiber. And it also comes out with water. So there you have it. You will need some sort of marking tool. Choose wisely and choose the one that you think is going to be best for you. Okay, rulers and tape measures are a must. Now these rulers here, I have a lot of different sizes. These are see-through, you can see right through it. So if you're doing a lot of pattern making or pattern work, this is gonna be a necessity. Especially, and these smaller ones too, if you're gonna be doing large pieces where you're adding seam allowances, but also these smaller ones come in handy when you're marking your fabric. If you know you have a certain place from the side and you need to mark at a certain amount, you can actually see through this to the fabric. So the nice thing about these and what make these are kind of like an industry standard is that these rulers are bendable. Don't overbend them, they will break, and they will also melt if left in a hot car. The reason we use these is a lot of times we need to actually measure the specific amount around a armhole or a neckline or a waistline, and these curve very nicely around that area, much better than a tape measure, and it's more accurate. Now if you do leave these in a hot car and they get all warped and wonky, you need to throw these away and replace it because the measurement will no longer be accurate. So these are the type of rulers I would suggest. Now a tape measure, you're going to need one of these. This one is I believe a fiberglass tape measure. Probably you'll see these all over the place. Most fabric stores have these for like $1. So you will need one of these. Make sure generally they just go up to 60 inches and that's really all you're going to need. But understand that these tape measures have a lifespan. They are fiberglass and oil-based and they will dry out. Again, if you leave it in a hot car, it will stretch out. Please do not roll them up in little teeny tiny wads like this and then tighten it. You know, I used to do that very long ago. It was a stress reliever. But what that does is that it actually stretches the tape, and then your measurements become inaccurate, right? The other thing you don't want to do is to wad it up like this and throw it in your kit, because that leaves creases. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take it over to the ironing board and, you know, put a cloth over it and iron it out nice and flat with all that nice heat and steam. And what that does is it stretches it out and you lose your accuracy. Honestly, 1 inch could easily become 1 1/4 inches. When I was in the industry doing a lot of pattern making and tech design and doing a lot of measuring, I replaced my tape measure at least once a month. So what you can do to preserve it is just to fold it up very softly and lay it in your kit where it's not going to get smashed, or you can actually just hang it up on a hook in your sewing room. So that's my suggestion, and replace your tape measures often because you don't know when they're not going to be accurate. Okay, so you'll need rulers and you'll need a tape measure. You will need a loop turner. You do not have to purchase this specific brand, but you will need one of these. I have several exercises both on the home side and on the apparel production side where we're going to be creating button loops and shoulder straps, and you'll need this to turn it. It has a hook on one end with a catch release, and that's going to come in very handy when you turn things inside out. So make sure you can see that here. It looks just like a little loop catcher and a little hook. Okay, so notice how long this one is. So there are shorter ones, but understand that our loops or our straps are going to be fairly long. So you'll need one that can actually pierce through or get through our long tube when we scrunch up the fabric here. So there are some shorter ones if you're going to be doing short loops, but generally this size is going to be the best bet for you to get. Tweezers are also a good idea. These are both the same kind, but the specific kind that you really need to get is that they're a little bit longer and they have a crooked neck up here. So this will actually help you to thread any needles. I know that I've discussed a needle threader, but this will actually help while your needle is in the machine, help you to thread that needle in there. Also, this will help you to pick out any corners or pull any corners out of any kind of your sewing, like if you have a collar corner, it will actually help you to pull that out and get it really pointed. So a pair of these tweezers is actually a good idea. Don't think that you can go to the drugstore and get the tweezers for your eyebrows. Those ones just aren't as good as these ones. So buy a pair of these. So let's talk about screwdrivers. So I have 3 different sizes here. Now, if you're a home sewer, you may not need a screwdriver. You may have a small tool that came with your machine to actually unscrew for the needle. Most sewing machines today, the presser foot comes off with a latch. So you may not need any of these screwdrivers for your machine. If you're a fashion student and you're in school and you're using an industrial machine, you're going to need probably a few different sizes of screwdrivers. This small screwdriver is for the needle and for smaller screws that you might need. But just one little note about that. You have another screwdriver here, which is good for the presser foot, getting that in and out in the machine. Now, I've talked to a lot of different mechanics about these 2 sizes of screwdrivers, and they actually prefer this one as the multi screwdriver. The small one, to get the needle in and out, there's this tiny little screw, as you saw in the machine orientation, to loosen and tighten for that. So a lot of times what happens is this edge will actually get kind of busted up because you nick the screw. But what happens is, because when you do that, sometimes you tighten too tight with this and then it strips the screw on the inside. So what happens is the mechanic has to replace that piece where the screw goes in. So the mechanics I've talked to, they prefer this one for you to use this one to get that screw in there to tighten that needle up. There's much less chance of you stripping that screw. So this size is actually perfect. If you can't find this one locally, of course, you can go to the hardware store and get a screwdriver. I've used this one a number of times, especially for getting that presser foot on and off. So on an industrial machine, there are two screws that you have, one for the needle and one for the foot that you're using. So I would suggest this one or this one. Okay, so let's talk about the presser feet that you're going to need. So this really just only applies to fashion students or students who have an industrial sewing machine. There are several different types of feet that you need. There should be 5 that you get right away. If you're a home sewing machine user, then you should have a complete set of the feet that you would need for most of the lessons. If there's a specialty foot, I'm going to do if I do a tutorial or a project with a specific foot, I will let you know at the beginning of that project. So for fashion students, most schools that I taught in, these are the 5 that their feet that they're going to want you to get. So this is the basic regular presser foot that you will do most of your sewing with. The thing that you have to be aware of is the number that is on the foot here, if you can see that. There's a number here, and you will need to ask your instructor for that specific number. Not all of these regular feet actually fit all machines, so you need to make sure that you have that right number. So there are a couple other feet that I want to show you that look the same. This is actually the same foot, except it has this safety bar here, which you may find if you're in school, you may have that. And also some home machines may actually have something like this foot as well. It's the same regular plain foot, it just has a finger guard here to keep you from, accidentally sewing your finger. So this other foot, which is the same regular foot, is the same, it's a different color, and you may actually find that there are different colors of these, solid white or it's thicker. This is a Teflon foot, and what it is it's a type of plastic, and it has a smooth glide foot, so you can sew on top of like vinyl or plastic. This is also if you don't want your fabric to get hurt by the presser foot. If there's some grooves here, sometimes they get worn. Like lightweight fabrics like a Teflon foot as well. It glides through the machine a lot nicer. So these two are not required, they're the same thing, but it's a nice addition to have. The other 2 other feet are going to be your piping or cording feet, and what these have, it's easier to see it underneath. There's a little cutout here on both of these. There's a little cutout here, right, on either side, and there are 2 different sides. So you need a left and a right of cording feet. Then you have this foot here, which is a narrow foot. It has a hole in the center of it. And this will come in handy if you're going to be doing, you can use it for a zipper foot. It gets there pretty closely. These other 2 feet, these cording feet, are better with zippers, and once we get into the exercises, I will explain that. But this narrow foot comes in handy if you're doing narrow seams, all right? So I've actually used this one sometimes to get a little bit closer if I'm working with piping and things like that, but I don't want to get onto the piping. So this is a good one to have. This other one here, which looks like a big chunk square thing, and it's got these grooves on the other side, is an invisible zipper foot. So the coils of the zipper out actually travel along these little grooves here. I'm not particularly fond of this foot. However, most schools require it, and I will show you how to use this foot. The reason that I'm not really fond of it is because the new invisible zippers have big plastic heads at the beginning of them, and so you have to get that passed in here, whereas I would rather use something like this at the beginning and then switch to this. So we'll get into all that once we do the exercises, but this foot is actually very good to have. Okay, so for fashion students, most of the apparel supply companies will offer these 5 as a package for like $12 or $15. Otherwise, don't quote me on that. Otherwise, they're usually $3 to $5 a piece. Now, along with that, you will need screws for your machine. I put a different piece of paper here so you can actually see this little teeny tiny screw. And as you saw, they're easily lost. This is the screw that puts your needle, that holds your needle in. So I would suggest buying several of these. They're usually 25 to 35 cents. And then you have this larger screw here. This is a screw that holds your presser foot on. And I usually would suggest buying a couple of these. These screws get lost all the time. So I would just have some ready on hand. If you lose something, if you're in a class, if you lose one of the screws, don't depend on your instructor to have all of these things for you. You won't be given all of this equipment in the industry when you work in the industry. So you need to make sure that you have all of your supplies all ready to go, right? So I always have like 3 or 4 of these little guys here, and then about 2 or 3 of these other screws. So those are the basic feet that I think that you should have. Of course, if you're a home sewer, your machine should have come with all these basic feet. And of course, I'll be showing you how to use all of them during the projects. So a notcher and an awl are pretty required if you're a fashion student, adding to your knowledge with these videos. In the industry, the pattern notcher obviously is used to notch out the notches around the perimeter of a pattern, and an awl is most commonly used to punch the holes through the pattern or the fabric for any kind of markings like pocket placement. So the notcher, you can also see it from this side. It actually clips out the paper at that notch, which are used for aligning and matching up and sewing process. So this is a 1/4 inch long by 1/8 inch here, and this is pretty standard size. They come in different sizes. You can get a longer one or a shorter one, but they generally are mostly 1/8. Sometimes you can actually find 1/16. If the knit company prefers a slit or a slit notches, then they're going to be quite small. Normally for knits, you will have triangular notches on the outside of the perimeter. So a notcher is pretty much standard in the industry, especially if you're a fashion student. So the awl, again, will punch through the paper, and in some cases you may, as well on some wovens that are tightly woven, punch all the way through the fabric instead of marking it. But when you punch through the pattern paper, it allows an opening so that you can get in there with your marking instrument to mark your placement, or your drill hole. Punch hole, drill hole is pretty much the same thing. So these two tools are not really very standard in the home sewing industry or area, but in the apparel industry they are quite common, and if you're a student, you should have these in your kit. You will need tape, and the specific kind of tape that you will need is this. This is Scotch brand. There are other brands you can use, but they call it magic tape, and it has a matte finish on the tape itself. It's not glossy. It's not gift wrap tape. The reason you want to use the matte tape is because it doesn't yellow and you can write on it. So let me just show you what that means. I've got some paper here. There's the piece of tape. I can write on it with a pencil. I can write on it with a ballpoint ink pen, and I can even write on it with a Sharpie. Now, if you write on it with a Sharpie or a marker, you will need to let it dry, otherwise it will still smudge a little bit. If you're doing pattern making or things like that, you're going to actually be writing on a lot of the tape. When you download my patterns and you cut them out and you tape them together, it's a good idea to be using this tape instead of the shiny tape because you may need to write on it as well. And I like to keep my tape in a big dispenser like this. It keeps it really handy on the table. If you are a fashion student and you're doing pattern making, you're going to need to buy a lot of this tape. A lot of other stores that carry it have their own store brand of this. Just make sure that it says matte finish, M-A-T-T-E. I would also suggest some safety pins. These come in various sizes. I prefer these larger size safety pins. These work well to actually safety pin all of your work together so that pieces don't get lost. You can, of course, purchase a box full of assorted sizes when you're working with elastic and drawstrings, trying to pull them through a casing. The larger sizes are, of course, easier to grip. So safety pins are just another thing that would be nice to have in your kit. Now, I just want to remind you about needles. You will need needles in your kit. And again, for all the exercises, unless I specify specifically, I'm going to be using a size 12. So these are what they look like when you purchase them at a fabric store for the home environment. And then this is what they will look like when you purchase them at a industrial apparel supply store. They'll come in these little packets like this. So understand that there is a difference between home needles and industrial sewing machine needles, and I have a much larger tutorial about that. So go and watch the needles tutorial, and that will tell you the differences. It will also tell you a lot of information about the needles and the markings. So you need to probably have a few different sizes. Whenever I'm going to be using a different size needle in the exercise, I will tell you that beforehand. So if you don't have one that size, you can actually acquire one. So I always have, these on hand. You never know when you're going to break one. And if you don't have an extra one in your kit, well, then that just kind of slows you down. So I always buy like at least two packages of these when I go to the store. So again, just a reminder about needles. If you're more interested about the needle properties, then please, I highly recommend you watching the needles tutorial. I want to remind you that you're going to need thread and fabric. So the thread, I have a very long and extensive thread tutorial that I suggest you watch. I mentioned dual duty Coats and Clark and also the Gooderman. That's what these two are. And then I also talked about the cone thread and what you should look for on the inside for the marking, depending on what you're going to be using. So now understand that when you buy the thread and your fabric, you need to match the thread to the fabric. So that's kind of an important thing. So if your thread doesn't match, your current thread doesn't match the fabric you buy while you're at the store, you'll need to buy thread that matches the fabric. So this fabric here is a batik. You don't have to buy a batik. I just wanted to show you the hand on this. It's easy to work with. It doesn't stretch. And for beginners, whether you're a home sewer or a student taking a class, or you're interested in going into the apparel industry, cotton, a nice medium weight cotton like this is very easy to sew with until you're more advanced. So I just wanted to remind you that you're going to need fabric and thread. So now for all of the exercises here at Apparel Arts Academy, I'm going to be using red thread, and I'm going to be doing all the projects in muslin. So that means that I don't have matching thread, but that doesn't mean that you don't have to. So I use red thread and muslin so that you can see all of my stitching and what I'm doing. And that's for your benefit. So I think that will help you see what's kind of going on. So all of my projects at the end will look kind of boring, but you will actually be able to see where the thread is going and where I'm stitching with the red on the muslin. All right, so that was just a reminder, thread and fabric per project. Okay, so notepad and pens or pencils, this should be a no-brainer. You're going to need some sort of notepad for taking notes along the way. Of course, your writing tools, whichever you prefer, if you like to take your notes on your phone or on your tablet. Make sure you're always taking notes. I know here with an online class that you're enrolled in, you can always go back to the video or pull down the PDFs. That's great. If you're a student in a school, always take notes because the professor may not be available if you're actually in a physical face-to-face class. So take notes, have something handy. Don't rely on a friend to do that for you. I know this has been a long explanation of the tools and supplies, but I thought it was important for you to understand the tools, what they do, and why they're so important to have on hand before you start your project.